Alright, so let's consider now what would happen if we have a change, a shift in aggregate supply. So let's suppose that there has been a technological improvement that affects all sorts of different kinds of production throughout the economy. So we're talking about improved technology that shows up in lots of different businesses. So it's not just one business, it's economy-wide, so this affects all producers. So therefore we can talk about it in terms of aggregate supply. So remember, if it's something that changes the cost of production, it's going to cause a change or a shift in aggregate supply. So let's suppose, for our example, that we have an improvement in technology, so we're going to have an increase in aggregate supply. It has become easier, it has become less expensive to produce, and that's therefore changing the entire relationship between desired production and the average price level. What happens to the equilibrium GDP, unemployment rate, and inflation rate as a result of this improvement in technology? We'll tell the story graphically, and we'll tell the story in words, and they will give us the same story, but it's two different ways of looking at what happens as a result of this event. So we'll draw a graph over here. Nice straight line there. We can do better than that. We will draw a graph over here to kind of get us started. We'll do the story in words first, but we'll set the scene with our graph. So we'll measure the price level on the vertical axis, GDP on the horizontal axis. We'll draw in a downward sloping aggregate demand curve and an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And I guess at this point it's probably useful to mention that what we're interested still is thinking about short run. We're talking about the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, who is interested in the short run. So this technically is the short run aggregate supply that we are interested in. And that'll become important kind of later in the course. But for now, you don't really need to think about anything different. It just note that we're going to call this the short run aggregate supply. So we start off in equilibrium, and our equilibrium has an initial price level we'll call P sub 0, and a level of GDP that we will call GDP sub 0. And we start in equilibrium where desired spending and desired production are equal to one another at that level of prices, resulting in that level of spending, production, and GDP. Now, something happens to make it easier for businesses to produce. Some technological change occurs that it's easier for businesses to produce, and the easier for businesses to produce at every price level means we're going to have an increase in aggregate supply. So, at the original price level, because it's easier to produce, the amount of desired production is now greater than the amount of desired spending. So the first thing we can note is that as a result of this change in technology, this improvement in technology, desired spending is now greater, desired production is now greater than desired spending. Right? And so this is kind of how we're always going to examine or analyze what happens when there's a shift in either aggregate demand or aggregate supply. We're going to compare desired spending and desired production. In this case, since desired production is greater than desired spending, that means that businesses are producing more things than consumers or other buyers are buying, and so inventories are going to then pile up. So businesses find their inventories piling up because the production is greater than the desired amount of spending. All right, now, with inventories piling up, what do businesses do as a result? Well, as inventories pile up, businesses are going to take an action, and the action they're going to take has to do with prices. And so we can say what happens because inventories are piling up is that businesses cut prices. And so that is our sequence of events. The technology changes, makes it easier to produce. Because it's easier to produce, desired production is greater than desired spending. Because desired production is greater than desired spending, businesses pile up. businesses pile up? Businesses' inventories pile up. Because businesses' inventories pile up, businesses cut prices. Now, as businesses cut prices, we're going to find that people are going to buy more stuff, and so the inventory will be come back in line with where businesses want it to be. Now, there are a couple of other things, though, we can say here as a result of this. Businesses are producing more. Right? So that means that GDP is rising, and we know that GDP is rising because we've seen that there has been increased production. Now, even though technology has improved, and that's making it easier to produce and leading to greater production, we're still going to argue that because we're producing more, businesses need more people. Because remember, we're not talking about one particular business or one particular industry, we're talking about the whole economy. So if there's been some technology, robots, say, make it easier to produce, we still have to ask, who's making the robots? Somebody's making the robots. Somebody's making that technology. Maybe they are not welding cars on an assembly line, but somebody's making the robots, and somebody's designing the robots, and somebody's programming the robots that do the welding on the assembly line. So there's going to be an increase in production, but the increase in production is accompanied by hiring additional workers. Somewhere, additional workers are going to be hired. It may not be in the industry that's actually producing the product, but somebody's making the technology. And so therefore, because we're hiring additional workers, we can say that the unemployment rate goes down. And lastly, we know that businesses were cutting prices because their inventories were piling up, and so we can therefore say that the price level falls, the rate of inflation goes down. That's our story. And again, it's a sequence of events. There's a particular order in which things occur. Because technology improved, desired production is greater than desired spending. Because desired production is greater than desired spending, inventories pile up. Because inventories pile up, businesses cut prices. And so there's a sequence, things happen in a particular order. Now, we can show this story graphically. We have an increase in aggregate supply brought about an improvement in technology. An increase in aggregate supply means that businesses are going to be able to produce more at every price level, so we're moving out that way, to the right along the horizontal axis. So our aggregate supply curve shifts out to the right. We'll draw in a new aggregate supply curve that is shifted out to the right. And from that we can identify what's going to happen. Here's our new equilibrium GDP. So we have a higher GDP, we'll call that GDP1. So GDP has increased. We're assuming that because we're producing more, we're hiring additional workers. We can't show it on the graph. But what we can show on the graph is the price level, and the price level has come down, and so there's our lower rate of inflation. So we get the same results in our graph that we got in our story. And that's the way it's supposed to be. They're just two different ways of talking about the same event. So the graph is designed to kind of point us in the right direction. It kind of tells us what's happening, and we can reason out why it happened. But if for some reason the graph intimidates you, you don't like the graph, whatever reason, as long as you can tell the story in words, you're good. In fact, it's much more important to be able to tell the story in words than to do the graph. The graph is just designed as kind of an aid to help us explain the story in words. So, an increase in aggregate supply leads to higher GDP, lower unemployment, lower inflation. All sorts of good things happen with that increase in aggregate supply. You should be able to work out for yourself what would happen if we had a decrease in aggregate supply. What sorts of things would happen, and what would the result be in terms of GDP, unemployment, and inflation?